What if the next ice age began tomorrow? Not slowly, not over centuries, but suddenly. One morning, the sun rises weaker than yesterday. By nightfall, temperatures fall faster than any forecast predicted. Snow does not melt, it stays. Within days, the world realizes something is wrong. This is not winter. This is the beginning of a new age of ice. When most people hear ice age, they imagine glaciers moving slowly over thousands of years. But if one were triggered abruptly by volcanic eruptions, solar shifts, or collapse in ocean currents, the cold would not wait for civilization to prepare. Temperatures could fall to minus 120 degrees Celsius in some regions, cold so extreme that exposed skin would freeze in seconds, cold so deep that engines would fail, crops would die, and cities would become silent. We like to believe modern technology makes us safe, that satellites, power grids, and machines would protect us. They wouldn't. Because technology depends on stability, and an ice age destroys stability first. Power plants would freeze, solar panels would be buried, wind turbines would snap under ice, oil would thicken, pipelines would crack, transportation would collapse almost immediately. Within weeks, food supply chains would break. Most of the world's crops grow in open air. They need sun, rain, and soil that isn't frozen solid. But the ground would turn into stone, fields would vanish under endless snow, animals would starve, supermarkets would empty in days. Panic would spread faster than the cold. Cities would become traps. Millions of people would try to flee south, highways would clog, airports would shut down, fuel would become more valuable than gold. And then reality would settle in. There is nowhere warm left. An ice age does not respect borders, it reshapes continents. Oceans begin to freeze at their edges, storms grow violent, blizzards erase entire towns from the map. Humanity would face the same question our ancestors once did. How do you survive when the planet itself turns against you? Scientists have already studied this possibility, and the answer they reached is terrifying. We cannot save everyone. Not with underground bunkers, not with cities under glass domes, not with rockets to space. The scale is too large. The time is too short. One of the only realistic survival concepts looks less like a city and more like a moving organism, a massive ecosystem on rails. Imagine a train over a kilometer long, running day and night, never stopping, not to transport people, but to keep them alive. The motion of the train generates electricity, its wheels become power plants, its engine becomes the heart of a living system. Inside, every section has a purpose. Some wagons are filled with artificial sunlight. Hydroponic farms grow vegetables without soil. Rows of glowing plants replace forests that no longer exist. Other wagons hold animals, chickens, cows, fish tanks, even insects for protein. Enough to sustain a small population without ever stepping outside. Another section becomes a water factory. Ice is collected, melted, purified, every drop recycled. Then there are medical cars, engineering cars, living quarters, schools, hospitals, everything humanity needs to function sealed inside metal walls. A civilization in motion, not to escape the cold, but to outrun it. Because movement would be survival. If the train stops, people die. But here is the brutal truth. Building one such train would already be nearly impossible. Building enough for billions? Unthinkable. Even if construction began today, only a tiny fraction of humanity could be saved. The rest would face a world where food cannot grow, heat cannot last, and shelter eventually fails. This is the part no one likes to admit. An ice age would not be equal. It would not be fair. It would choose survivors based on preparation, location, and resources. History has shown this before. When climates changed suddenly in the past, entire civilizations vanished, not because they were weak, but because they were unready. And modern humanity is more connected than ever, which also means more fragile than ever. Our cities rely on constant energy, our food relies on constant transport, our lives rely on systems that assume tomorrow will look like today. An ice age would break that assumption, and once broken, it would not be repaired quickly, not in years, not in decades, maybe not in centuries. This would not be a disaster movie. There would be no heroes racing against time to fix the weather. There would only be survival and loss and the long silence of a frozen world. The question is not whether technology could help some people survive. The question is whether humanity as a whole could adapt fast enough. Because when the ice comes, it does not negotiate. When the cold becomes permanent, the world changes its rules. Governments are built for crisis, but not for extinction-level climate shifts. Emergency plans assume floods, earthquakes, wars. They do not assume a planet that can no longer grow food. At first, leaders would speak calmly. They would tell people to stay indoors, to conserve energy, to wait. But waiting would become impossible. Electric grids would fail one by one. Nuclear plants would shut down to avoid meltdown. Communication satellites would freeze in orbit. The internet would fracture into small islands of connection. Information would become as valuable as heat. Borders would harden. Nations would seal themselves off, protecting what little warmth and food they had left. Migration would turn into conflict, not over land, but over temperature. Cities would be the first to fall. Skyscrapers are not designed for minus 120 degrees. Concrete cracks, steel becomes brittle, water pipes explode inside walls. Millions would crowd into underground spaces, subway tunnels, basements, parking structures. But underground does not mean safe. Air must be filtered, water must be heated, food must be grown. Without constant power, underground cities become tombs. Society would reorganize around survival. Money would lose meaning. You cannot eat currency. You cannot burn stock markets for warmth. Value would shift to skills. Engineers, farmers, doctors, mechanics. Those who know how to fix machines. Those who know how to grow food without soil. Those who know how to keep bodies alive in impossible conditions. Everything else becomes secondary. Education would change. Children would no longer learn about distant careers. They would learn how to maintain filters, how to recycle water, how to grow plants under artificial suns. Culture would shrink. There would be no concerts, no sports stadiums, no tourism. There would be stories and memory. People would talk about beaches, about forests, about rain that did not hurt. The sky itself would disappear. Snowstorms would block sunlight for weeks at a time. Days would blur into nights. Season would lose meaning. Psychologically, humanity would fracture. Isolation would become normal. Claustrophobia would become universal. Hope would become rare. And above all, inequality would explode. The wealthy would survive first, not because they deserved to, but because they could afford preparation. Private shelters, private trains, private ecosystems. The poor would face the cold directly. This would not be a united species fighting nature together. It would be fragments of humanity trying to hold on. Religion would return stronger than ever, not because of tradition, but because people would need meaning. When the sun disappears and the world becomes ice, Faith becomes shelter. Some would believe the Ice Age is punishment. Others would believe it is a test. Others would simply believe it is the end. Science would still work, but slowly. Laboratories would move underground. Experiments would focus on one goal: artificial life systems. Plants that grow without sunlight, animals that survive in cold, machines that recycle everything. Humanity would become an indoor species. We once learned to control fire. Now we would learn to control climate inside metal walls. And outside those walls, the Earth would look alien. Frozen oceans, white continents, black skies filled with snow. Entire ecosystems would collapse. Birds would vanish. Insects would die. Forests would turn to crystal. Only creatures built for cold would remain. Wolves, polar animals, microbes. The planet would belong to winter. The moving trains would become legends, stories of cities that never stop, of people who live on rails, of artificial suns inside steel shells. Not everyone would believe they exist. Some would try to reach them, most would fail. And slowly, humanity would split into two histories: those who lived inside machines and those who froze outside them. This is what makes the Ice Age terrifying. Not the temperature, but the transformation. From a world of freedom to a world of survival. From civilization to endurance. If humanity survived the first shock, the next question would be even more frightening. Could we adapt to a frozen world? Not temporarily, not for a season, but for generations. Because an ice age is not a storm that passes, it is a new reality. Children would be born who have never seen rain, never touched soil, never felt sunlight on their skin. Their world would be corridors of metal and glass, artificial light, recycled air, endless white outside the walls. Human bodies would begin to change. Less exposure to sunlight would weaken bones. Skin would grow paler. Eyes would adapt to dim light. Muscles would shrink from confined movement. Medicine would keep people alive, but evolution would begin silently. Over centuries, humans might become smaller, more efficient, built for cold and darkness. A new kind of humanity. Language would change too. Words for seasons would disappear. Spring and summer would become myths. Children would ask what warm wind means. Art would shift inward. Paintings of forests would be considered fantasy. Songs about oceans would sound like stories from another planet. Memory would become sacred. Museums would no longer show dinosaurs, they would show trees. Books would preserve images of a world that no longer exists: a blue sky, a sunset without ice, grass under bare feet. And the earth itself would keep moving. Glaciers would advance slowly, crushing cities beneath them. Paris, Berlin, New York, Tokyo, buried under kilometers of ice. History would be sealed inside frozen layers. Future generations might discover skyscrapers the way we discover fossils. Civilization would become archaeology. But adaptation is not just physical, it is moral. Humanity would be forced to redefine what life is worth. Who gets space inside the shelters? Who gets medicine? Who gets food when supplies run low? These would not be political questions. They would be survival questions. And survival changes ethics. Compassion would fight against necessity. Some communities would become cooperative, sharing everything, protecting everyone. Others would become ruthless, guarding resources, closing doors, letting outsiders freeze. The Ice Age would test not only technology, but humanity itself. And yet, there would be something remarkable. Even in a frozen world, humans would still dream. Children would draw suns, scientists would plan ways to melt the ice, poets would write about warmth, because humans are not designed only to survive, they are designed to hope. Over time, technology would improve. Fusion power, geothermal cities, artificial climates. Small, warm zones might appear on the planet again, islands of life in oceans of ice. Humanity would no longer live everywhere. It would live in pockets, like stars in a dark sky. The population would shrink dramatically, from billions to millions, from millions to thousands. But the species would continue, not because the Earth was kind, but because humans refused to disappear. The Ice Age would not end humanity, but it would end the world we know. The forests, the oceans, the animals, the seasons, they would become memories. And that is the real fear, not death, but forgetting what it was like to live freely under the sun. The final question would not be, can we survive? It would be, what kind of humanity survives? A species of machines in metal corridors, or one that someday finds warmth again? Because if the ice ever melts, the survivors would step onto a planet that feels brand new, a second beginning. And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside the disaster, that humanity is fragile, but also stubborn, that civilization can fall, but life continues, and that the future is not guaranteed. It is earned through preparation, through cooperation, through memory. Because if an ice age started tomorrow, only a small part of humanity would make it, but the story of those who survived would become the next chapter of human history, and everything before it would be known as the Warm Age.